Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about surprising result of my research, which as Ms. Chaun mentioned, who had been revolving around Buddhist nuns community in Joseon, Korea. And this tale was probably one of the most surprising consequences of my random search for anything related to Buddhist nuns in Joseon period. And I'll tell you why it was very surprising in a few minutes. But today's presentation will consist of various perspectives on the Imjin War. That's a kind of a new phrase that we start using in Korean studies as well as in Asian studies. The importance of non-mainstream perspective on official history. In this particular case, the position of Buddhist nuns in dominantly Confucian Joseon society. So it's in a way our attempt to look at one of the most tragic historical events in Korean history from the perspective of a nun, Buddhist nun, who happened to be probably very rare species by 16th century, because everybody still believes that they had disappeared by 16th century, but they actually appeared in a folk imagination as a military hero. So in that sense, we are looking at something that everybody seems to be aware of, but then never thought about the totally opposite kind of perspective given by the position of Buddhists in general, but especially Buddhist nuns in Joseon society. Okay, so for those who are not quite familiar with the Korean history, I'd like to first of all set up the temporal background of this story. The story is set in Joseon Dynasty, and Joseon Dynasty was founded in 1392 by a group of young folks led by Yi Sun-sin, who were armed with the new ideology, new ideas, which are not really new, but at least they pushed it as a ruling ideology of their new state that they're going to establish, Confucianism. So we are talking about a dynasty established by Confucians and which were ruled by Confucian elites. So this was the general political, ideological background of the story. And before we get to the story, by the way, how many of you had a chance to read this folk tale, Sun Master Chaun, that I, probably you got the story this morning? Yes, did you have a chance to look at some parts of it? It's a kind of long story. Would you like to take a quick look at the story? It's a 5-page, but it reads very fast. So maybe just about 2-3 minutes. So the first 3 pages of that handout give you this sort of the main story, and the last 2 pages is about their previous lives, the previous lives of those nuns who were involved in this particular battle. Okay? Are you almost done? Okay. What do you think about the story? I tried this direct translation to keep the original the flavor of folktale, so it's sort of a redundant, a bit sort of um, digression, here and there. But the main plot clearly shows that Buddhist nun showed up suddenly and helped the greatest military heroes of pre-modern Korea, including Admiral Yi Sun-sin, about whom you will see a videotape pretty soon. And so, of course, the person who told the folktale collector about this story added a little bit of his personal interpretations, but all in all, the gist is that the Buddhist nun showed up as a rescuer of Korean Navy, and she died heroically, so people got very curious about who she was and who they were. In fact, 3 nuns all come down to one person at the end, Master Chaun, Purple Cloud, Master Purple Cloud. And so they probably linked the main character of the folk tale with the famous monk hero, also military hero, Master Samyeong, and then 3 ladies who were in his lifetime associated with her one way or another. So I'm going to tell you the importance of this story by, first of all, talking about Imjin War itself. So unless you have immediate questions, let's look at the historical context of the story. So Joseon Dynasty was founded by elites who were followers of Confucianism. This was their rebellion against the domination of Buddhism in the previous state, which was Goryeo. So Goryeo dynasty was a Buddhist state, and toward the end of that the dynasty, of course, the usual, symptoms of the demise of the dynasty: political corruption, the interference of a religious institution with the court politics, and of course, Yuan dynasty in China, sort of interfering with the Korean political structures and all that. So when they founded the Joseon dynasty, they made it very clear that this will be a paradise of Confucians. And indeed, the dynasty maintained its peace for almost 200 years. And I don't know how many of you know that, but Joseon dynasty is the world's longest dynasty. By longest, it means that one royal household produced all the kings. They never changed hands in terms of who will succeed the throne. So sometimes it is called Yi dynasty in some of American history books, which is not really favored by Koreans because it reflects a colonial perspective on this particular dynasty. Was very prosperous, very advanced in technology and all that. But when Japan occupied Korea in 1911, they kind of downgraded most of the achievements of pre-modern Korean society. So they started calling Yi dynasty as if it was a personal thing, that it was the last name of the royal household of Joseon dynasty. So the official name is Joseon dynasty. So what is Imjin War then? This is perhaps the most devastating event in the history of Joseon, because Joseon lost tremendously, not only in terms of human casualties, but culturally, politically, economically. So we call the first about 2 centuries of Joseon history early Joseon, and then post-war period, and then later on until 1911 is called late Joseon. So we actually divide the history of Joseon into 2 over this important war period. So this is a kind of very tragic, but it's a kind of landmark. So what is Imjin War? This is literally, as you see on the screen here, the first 2 Chinese characters indicate Imjin in Korean pronunciation, and that is the year it's the name of the year. You know that East Asian society follow this particular cycle, right, of the calendar. So Imjin is 1592. And then where the third character is the name which now has some positive meanings, but in pre-modern East Asia, that was a popular sort of a name for Japanese. It means sort of a little people, small people. But anyway, there's the Japanese, and the last character is, in Korean pronunciation again, is a ran. And the ran means a rebellion. So literal translation of this particular phrase is Japanese rebellion of the Imjin year. Okay, so Japanese rebellion in 1592. Now, this is a common phrase that Koreans are familiar with, but outside Korea, this word is hardly known. And for that reason, a lot of Westerners thought that what is this Imjin? It's a mere rebellion. But then those who approached this war from Japanese historical perspective thought that, well, this is some minor kind of event in Japan-Korea relationship and later part of Joseon dynasty. But in fact, it was the most devastating experience for Koreans, and Japan also underwent a severe change, a change of political power because of the consequence of this war. And there are several names given to this war. One is Imjin War, literally, and Koreans use Hideyoshi invasion, clearly indicating that it was Japan's invasion for no justified reason. And so Hideyoshi invasion is a Korean term, as you see in parentheses, and Imjin War is getting more circulation in among scholars because it is indeed a full-scale war for 7 years. And then another name is a 7-year war because the war lasted for 7 years. The first 5 years and then the second invasion lasted 2 years, altogether 7 years. And then the title of the recent book by Stephen Turnbull indicates this war as a samurai invasion of Korea. So whatever name you come across, we're talking about the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592, which we call the year of Imjin. So what's the circumstances of this war? I'd like to talk about the great contrast between the preparedness for this war on both sides. In Korea, what happened was that after the initial struggle of the founders of Joseon dynasty, finally they achieved peace and social structure became stable. So almost 2 centuries, Korea enjoyed peace, and there were no major battles other than occasional skirmishes on the northern border, which Joseon shared with Julcheons. Julcheons are small tribic nomadic people up in the north of Korean peninsula. With China, almost no military clashes. But then occasionally we also had to deal with Japanese pirates. In fact, until Hideyoshi invasion in 1592, the only major military campaigns that Korea had with the Japanese were just the raids of Japanese pirates. And why pirates were so prosperous on the Southern Sea in sort of near Korean peninsula and Tsushima Island on Japanese side, was that Joseon was always very weary of having too many trading posts with the Japanese. So they kind of limited always the amount of trade and the times, etc., etc. They even designated a couple of places near the southern coastal areas where Japanese merchants could stay and do the international trade. And you could imagine before the Imjin War, Japan had 2 routes of importing advanced knowledge and technology, which was through Korea or through sea route directly from Japan, China. And so pirates were almost every day seen in the southern coastal area of Korean peninsula, and they never really waged a major battle or anything like that. But Korean governments knew that they were kind of a headache all the time. But because of the almost 2 centuries of relative peace and economic prosperity, and the unique, not necessarily unique, but this heavy emphasis on the Confucian learning, which always emphasized the classics from ancient China, and filial piety and loyalty and benevolence and things like that. Korea was in a kind of a complacent state, that they never imagined that they would engage in major battle, although they already knew that the political situation in Japan was changing very rapidly, and some obviously reported that we have to be prepared for, prepare ourselves for a major war, because there are various symptoms already noticed. So there were reports from envoys and various sources that Japan was preparing for a major campaign. However, partly because the kind of sort of a peace and the direct military confrontation on the Korean side, that they thought that, okay, maybe weighing this conflicting information, probably it'll be too much to kind of surprise people with this kind of scary news of a war. So on Joseon court, those who were kind of reluctant to admit that Japan was ready for a major war sort of dominated. On the other hand, in Japan, they by mid 16th century, the long civil war, which had lasted nearly for 3 centuries, came to an end, and Japan was finally unified. And Hideyoshi, who through a series of intrigues and assassinations and this and that, came to be a victor who enjoyed the fruit of Japan's unification. So they were already had quite skilled warriors under his leadership. Hideyoshi himself, and I'm going to show you how the painting of Hideyoshi. So this is Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he came from sort of a lower class and made way all the way up to the top class as a military warrior. And then, of course, he was the commander of the entire Japanese army. Then you can imagine samurais trained for 3 centuries in civil war. So you can see the big difference between Korea and Japan in terms of, the eve of Imjin War. So when Japanese invaded in 1592, they arrived actually the southeastern tip of the peninsula, which is Busan. It's my hometown. It's a seaside city now, and the second largest city in Korea. And the Japanese army took 3 routes to go all the way to Seoul, and then of course their ultimate aim was, as I put it in a handout, Hideyoshi's ambition was to occupy China. So Hideyoshi actually requested a couple of times officially that if you clear our path, then maybe we can be allied and attack China together. So that was his plan. And so the Japanese infantry, basically foot soldiers, arrived at Busan, but then they kind of took the 3 routes. In the meantime, they also sent a navy, and they tried to go around the western, southwestern tip of peninsula, and then provide, they were supply routes basically for those army who were already on land. So that was their plan. So when they arrived in Korea, they were equipped with muskets, as you know. These are the gunpowders and sort of firearms that had been introduced by Portuguese merchants and Portuguese missionaries. So these were Japanese army. And then this is the typical musket that they used. And this is a painting from 18th century depicting the siege of the fort of Dongnae. Dongnae was the main sort of focal point of the Busan area, the southeastern part of the Korean peninsula where Japanese landed. And they attacked in May, and in 24 hours, they already surrendered. so many people got killed because of this unexpected attack that this was a kind of firearms they used during that period. Let me see if I have some of these pictures later. Okay. That city was devastated. So many civilians were killed, and all the officials who were in charge of the area were killed or fled. They were so shocked that they could not even send consistent reports. The first report to the king said that, well, looks like we have about 90 Japanese boats. They look like trading ships. Then, in less than 2 days, second report arrived, and it says, well, looks like they have more boats, and in this time they were really, really alert. And then it looks several hundreds of boats have come in second wave. So now it looks like it's going to be war. But by then already, the southern cities were all destroyed, and then Japanese army landed on the peninsula. So what were the factors that actually came into this war in addition to Hideyoshi's invasion? Actually, there are some political factors, domestic from Japanese point of view. One is that as Japan became unified, the peace came, relative peace came. Now all this large number of samurai class basically became what? Almost jobless. They are useless class. So there's a mounting discontent. And of course, the distribution of land and wealth after the unification of Japan was not fair enough, right? From the point of view of some samurais and also their followers. So Hideyoshi had to find a way to channel out this anger and discontent. And so we can imagine that although not all the daimyos, the militias of Japan, supported Hideyoshi's invasion, their followers, especially these warriors, militia members, had no problems. They all were united about the cause of invading Korea. This is their domestic reason, and other reasons also sort of coalesced. One is that China and Joseon always were this sort of try to control the volume and the times of trade with Japan, especially in Korea. On Korean side, the Japanese pirates were so notorious that several times they had to close trading posts they had designated in earlier periods. Even there was a major campaign during King Sejong in 15th century, almost 100 some years before this incident. They found out that the main the stay of pirates came from Tsushima Island, which is the closest island to Korea. So they sent Korean armies actually conquer the island, and then they almost got a promise from the lord of that island that they will not create this problem again. So there are always this dissatisfaction among Japanese merchants that we need more trade. What Japan could provide China and Joseon was nothing compared to what they would get from China and Joseon. So what Japanese offered was mostly copper and some of these rare minerals and silver. But China and Japan, more than anything else, provided advanced technology and books, so ideas and science. So this was always an ongoing problem for Japanese. From economic point of view and then the point of view of international trade. But there's one more factor added to them. That is, a lot of Portuguese and Spanish merchants worked already in a certain part of China, and they were involved in this international trade between China and Japan. And they became increasingly important, and they took so much of a profit in that kind of, as a middleman, that Japanese wanted to have a direct trade with Joseon and China. So this was kind of their own reason why they have to attack China. And to do that, of course, they have to go through Korean Peninsula. So once again, we are looking at the problems that we had to face because Korea is a unique geopolitical condition. And interestingly, Japanese daimyos asked the Portuguese government to help them because they needed some trained Navy soldiers. So they asked the Portuguese government to dispatch some, well-trained Navy soldiers, but they refused. They said that we are not going to interfere with your own problems. Then what Portuguese did was actually they helped the Chinese. And how do we know about that? During this war, Koreans saw 4 black soldiers. And those 4 black soldiers are divers, extremely highly skilled divers. So they are like UDT members in our own terms. And then they came with the Chinese army, and then they fought during this army. And we always thought that it was a kind of a folk imagination, a folk tale or legend. But indeed, recently in Korea, we discovered a painting that depicts 4 strange-looking soldiers that were returning to China along with the large Chinese army. So they kind of matched the descriptions of these 4 they quote black soldiers, and in historical records, in oral tradition, with the painting itself, they indeed matched. So we know that the Portuguese actually sent some of those North Africans. They had already, ruled, right, in their slave trade and whatnot. So it was quite in a way, it was an international kind of war. So that was the general background of this war. And then I'll show you some of these paintings. Now, this is a cannon used by Joseon Navy, but it's part of the Japanese painting, a recent painting, and the Joseon Navy, again, in Japanese painting. As you can see, they are very heavily armed. As it turned out that this is not historically accurate. Navy soldiers were always clad very light, just in case they have to swim. So you can see the imagination of the Japanese painters, to glorify their own campaign. Now these are the kind of weapons that Joseon Army and the Navy used. You can see traditional weapons as well as cannons. Stephen Turnbull, who wrote Samurai Invasion of Korea, wrote that on almost every account, Japan was advanced in terms of firearms. They had the muskets, they had the cannons and everything, except in 2 areas, Joseon was far more advanced. One was actually this cannons, and Korean cannons are so powerful that actually during the naval battle that Japanese ships was easily destroyed. Japanese ships were easily destroyed because of these powerful cannons. And in fact, Korea produced the world's first rocket in 13th century. So by then, the technology, the military technology, especially when it comes to cannon, is far advanced in Korea. Okay. Now these are again part of those firearms that Joseon Army and Navy used. And this is again painting of the only naval battle Korea lost, called Chincheonryang battle. And you can imagine among 60-some fightings that only this battle was painted by Japanese historians. Why? Because this is the only one that they won. And why? Because Admiral Yi Sun-sin was not involved in this particular battle. And so you can imagine that, in fact, if you look at the details of this painting, that samurais and Japanese soldiers tried to get on board the Korean ship, and you can imagine these are very strong army in terms of the land fighting. So they were good at the swords and everything. So the tactic of Korean Navy was that to prevent them from coming on board of their ships. But Japanese boats had to go closer to Korean boats so that these soldiers could engage in hand-to-hand combat. Okay. And this is Admiral Yi Sun-sin. So before we get to Yi Sun-sin, let's get to the legacy part. So what happens? Korea lost between 250,000 to 1 million people. So this is a human casualty. Of course, there's no way of knowing how many people were killed and injured during this war, but so many people lost their lives. And then severe reduction, almost 40-some% of arable land was lost, destroyed. And more than that, Korean palaces, at least full-scale palaces were burnt down, and 4 out of 4 historical archives were burnt down or taken to Japan. So historical documents, many sutras, other cultural artifacts, paintings, scientific artifacts such as the rain, the particular machine that Joseon was famous for, machines that were invented to gauge the rain, right? The amount of rain. So all this technological stuff was also lost. In that sense, it was a really, really tragic loss, especially the loss of historical documents and cultural effects. And later I'll show you one of the greatest gains for Japanese is the potters. They took so many Korean skilled potters to Japan. This is the beginning of what we know the Japanese pottery skill nowadays. And ceramics started with the Korean potters taken as prisoners of war in Japan. Okay. For Japan side, of course, Hideyoshi lost control because they were successful only in the first year of their invasion. They actually could advance all the way to the Pyongyang, which is now the capital city of North Korea, right? So they could advance all the way to the not quite a border, but almost to the northern part of the Korean peninsula. But from second year, actually, they could immediately see the fierce resistance from what we call righteous army. We are talking about private militias in Korea. And also Ming army. So Ming China sent reinforcements. Almost 40,000 soldiers, troops came from China. So they also began to be involved in this war. And then the most important factor, Japan completely underestimated the naval power of Joseon Korea. So Admiral Yi Sun-sin came in the scene, and he is one of the very, very few naval commanders in history who never lost any battles he was engaged in. So we are talking about a military hero who has gained mythic stature in Korean history. So Admiral Yi Sun-sin controlled all the supply lines in the sea. So Japanese army could not advance with successfully as they had initially planned. That was also a major factor that the war almost came to stall from the second year. So then why did it last for 7 years? Japan tried to negotiate with China about various things that they wanted from China. One of them was partition of Korea between China and Japan, etc. So this sounds a bit familiar now, yeah? So the war continued. Ordinary people suffered, of course, during that time. And 1595, it looks like that the long, many years of a negotiation came to nothing. So then in 1950, I'm very sorry to repeat this. 1597, Japan invaded a second time, which is called a Jeongnyu War, okay? But usually historians put them together and call it Imjin War. That lasted altogether for 7 years. So finally, at the end, Japan surrendered. The Hideyoshi died, and all the soldiers had to retreat. And their retreat was very difficult because Admiral Yi Sun-sin made it clear that no enemy soldier would go back to Japan alive. So in the end, it was a very difficult war for Japanese themselves. So all in all, at the end of the day, it was a victory on Korea and China side rather than on Japan. So if you study Japanese history, this war is treated as a minor incident within the biography of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So they don't call this war, they call it small event on this year. That's why a lot of Western historians have no idea of the scale of this war, the impact, especially the legacies on the larger East Asian politics. Although I didn't put it in this handout, China also had to deal with the aftermath of this war because Ming China was financially very restrained after sending their troops twice, that it contributed to the fall of Ming China. And then after that, of course, we have Qing, the last dynasty in Chinese history. So it affected Korea, it affected Japan, because finally Hideyoshi died, his clan demised completely, and Tokugawa Ieyasu took control of Japan. Finally, they had a peaceful time. And after Tokugawa period, we have modern Japan. So we're talking about sort of the major incident that kind of brought about Tokugawa period. Okay? And China, Ming declined, and this war definitely contributed to that. So it affected all three countries in East Asia. So let's talk about Admiral Yi Sun-sin. Like I said, Admiral Yi Sun-sin was almost the only savior during this period, and he was indeed outstanding in his military skills, especially tactic. And there are several battles during which Japanese naval commanders and soldiers so awed by this ingenious tactic that Admiral Yi Sun-sin used. And then they recorded his character, very upright, steadfast, very silent, but very kind of a very charismatic figure. He was very tall for Koreans that time. And Stephen Turnbull, in his book, describes it as Korea's greatest hero and one of the outstanding naval commanders in the entire history of the world. So instead of me explaining how important Admiral Yi Sun-sin is, I'll show you a video clip. Okay. So let's have the first video clip.
On July 8, 1592, Hyangsoon, the narrow strait running from Tongyang, a fleet of 54 led by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, facing a Japanese combat fleet of 73. Admiral Yi Sun-sin lured the enemy into the narrow Hyangsoon Channel using 5 Panasonic battleships. He spread his fleet across both flanks and reared its head toward the massive Japanese fleet. His Hagikjin tactics had the Japanese fleet surrounded. Korean ships behind the island waited in ambush. a Gobuksun ship infiltrated the middle of the Japanese ships and defeated Japanese fleet. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, with more than 40 naval battles under his belt, went undefeated in his naval career. At the Battle of Myeonglang, the Admiral Yi's force, 12 battleships, completely wiped out a Japanese fleet of 130, with nary a loss. His naval tactics, his thorough knowledge of topology, and his fine personality made Admiral Yi Sun-sin respected even among Japanese forces. Up until the 16th century, naval battles mainly involved hand-to-hand combat, first colliding with, then boarding the enemy's ships. But Admiral Yi Sun-sin adopted his revolutionary tactics, crane wind formation, called Hagikjin, which surrounds the enemy fleet in a semicircle, and his fleet bombards their various cannons all at once. Joseon's fleet could concentrate their attacks on enemy's fleet, which was surrounded by Joseon's battleships in a crane wing formation. Japanese Admiral Togo Heihachiro revealed the secret of these tactics. The sub-duplicate ratio of firepower and could decisively defeat the battle against the undefeated Russian fleet. After this battle, the tactic is still adopted by today's Navy. Joseon's lands were devastated by the Japanese invasion of 1592. Never discouraged, the Joseon developed the previous unimagined battleship under the leadership of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, boasting excellent navigation and shipment technology. In the 16th century, most battleships were large V-shaped ships that were fast but required a large turn radius. The Joseon ships, on the other hand, used the U-shaped Panoksun ships. These Panoksun, or board-roof superstructure ships, were the only combat ships of the era with a standing turn radius near zero. Its second floor could carry nearly 20 firearms into battle. The modern understanding of packing, different amounts of gunpowder, taking into account distance and driving speed, was first used on these ships. The standing turn and using all arms on board. As mentioned, the Gobuksun ships could fire, turn 180 degrees, turn, fire, and turn again, making for previous unthinkable volleys against the enemy. The Gobuksun's drill is also worth mention. It was installed directly into the ship's hull and thus invulnerable to enemy attack. The ship's sails could be hoisted in all directions, even while covered, making it lighter, faster than all the others. its sniper cannons and sold at its dragon head. It could attack deep into enemy lines. Its left and right cannons, the engineering of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, and his utilization of the sub-duplicate ratio of firepower transformed the Gobuksun and hence the Joseon into a naval powerhouse of the 16th century.
So Yi Sun-sin is always associated with this turtle ship, and which was not his own invention, but obviously his leadership made it sort of necessary during this particular war, and the government pushed the project and then finalized the project, which had been going on for almost 1 century. Anyway, I'm going to show you the rest of the pictures that I brought. Okay, so this is again another painting of Yi Sun-sin enshrined in Korea. Now this is statue that you will see right in the middle of the city center in Seoul. So if you ask any Koreans to choose 2 most important historical figures in Korean history, they will choose, many of them will choose Yi Sun-sin, and then probably great King Sejong, who invented the Korean alphabet. So King Sejong represents the humanity side of the Korean achievements, cultural achievements, and Yi Sun-sin certainly represents a more military side. Okay? And another statue. Now this is tomb. He was killed by an enemy bullet in the very last battle, actually on the eve of a Japanese retreat. It was very sad. So the commander of a Chinese Navy was crying. It is recorded in book that he was so disappointed that Admiral Yi Sun-sin had been killed in the last minute, but that was sort of a stray bullet, and he died right before Japan completely withdrew from the Korean Peninsula. This is his war diary. He was a highly achieved writer, so he wrote poems, he recorded his psychological state as a leader, and all the nation completely depended on him. And his was the only victory news for the king, and the rest all, not all of them, but just a series of disappointing news of Korean army being defeated by Japanese, etc. So this is a national treasure for Koreans, and this is a typical boat that Korean Navy used, very sturdy, and on the top of this, they put the other cannons and stuff. Then eventually, this was the basis of a turtle ship. This is called the Panoksun. Again, turtle ships. And this is the painting of the return of the Ming Army. And here you find those, we believe, African soldiers hired by Portuguese who worked in South China. Now, here you see one of the biggest gains for Japanese from this war is the pottery skill. They took so many Korean potters, and they even ordered them to live in an isolated area so that they would continue the Joseon tradition of pottery. That's how they prevented, in a way, these potters highly trained potters from adopting Japanese skill. At least in the immediate post-war years, they had to be isolated and they were encouraged to continue the way they used to make potter in Korea. Now, these are not really for aristocracy in Joseon. These were regular bowls that Joseon people used. But when Japanese commanders were also very well educated elites saw these bowls, they thought that the simplicity and beauty and naturalness of these Korean pots, they eventually were enthusiastic collecting these bowls. So this is a national treasure in Japan now. Another bowl, tea bowl from Joseon, Korea. And now one of the tragic sites of this war you can still find in Japan and Korea is that Japanese armies cut the noses and ears of enemy soldiers, and that's how they counted how many casualties they dealt. So they brought these ears and noses to Japan and made a mound right in front of a special Buddha statue that Toyotomi Hideyoshi established for his own spiritual welfare. And they call this mound of ears. And we believe that about 120 to 150,000 people, obviously, represented by the size of this tomb. And a few years ago, Korean Buddhist monk, with the collaboration of a Japanese monk, established a small sort of a memorial stone to lay, these souls, Okay. Now, there are several folk tales springing up from this tragic, devastating experience for Koreans. One of them is, giseng. Giseng are courtesans and sort of entertainers, and they are prototypical women artists in pre-modern Korea, who I'm reluctant to compare them, but sort of a Korean version of geisha. But several of these giseng also sacrificed themselves, either lured Japanese commanders, had them drink a lot, and in the end, they were assassinated by Korean assassins and things like that. So one of them is the very famous giseng, Hyang. She was a concubine of the Korean commander who was killed, and she actually threw a party, and then eventually Japanese commander in Pyongyang was assassinated during that night, and instead of escaping, she actually opened a path for other Korean commanders to escape the Japanese ambush, and then she died right there. And then finally, Master Samyong. Now, one of the quote-unquote strange things that are related to this incident called the Imjin War is the formation of monk army, band of monks who took up arms to fight as soldiers. And this was the famous monk army in Korea, in pre-modern Korea. And the leader was Master Sŏn, and Sån himself is a awakened Zen master, Sun master. And you have to understand why this is kind of odd phenomenon. Joseon dynasty was self-proclaimed, sort of self-professed Confucian state. They adopted anti-Buddhist policy from the beginning. So they basically displaced all the monks and monks from the walls of the capital. So monks were relegated to the lowest caste among the Joseon society. So they were not allowed to enter the capital city, and they began basically move to mountain areas. In the previous state, Korea, they of course practiced in many city centers. But during Joseon, Buddhist communities had to basically move to mountain areas. And when Sån was already, quite a respectful Zen master, that this war broke out, and the miseries of ordinary people was just unimaginable. So finally, the government also kind of encouraged by the monks themselves, decided this is a righteous cause for them to be engaged in war. So they formed a monk army under the leadership commander of Sån. Now, Master Samyong, who appears in the tale of this folk tale you read is a direct disciple of Master Sŏn. So Samyang was originally a young man who were interested in reading the classical texts and stuff, and then he lost his parents and he became quite aware of the transience of life, so he decided to become a monk, and he was already, in his own right, he's quite a famous Zen master. And obviously he was very charismatic and had this respect in Japan too, and his fame was spread among Japanese army, that at the end of the war, because so many Korean prisoners of war kept in Japan, the Joseon court decided to send an envoy to bring back those prisoners. And among so many, they chose Master Samyang because he knew the war, because he had been fighting as a commander. And he also had quite a respect among Japanese because of his spiritual, accomplishment or achievement. Achievement is a wrong term from Buddhist point of view, but he was a Zen master, well-known Zen master. So he went to Japan, and he was tested by Japanese daimyos this way, that way, to see if he really truly enlightened, and obviously he proved himself as a Zen master more than anything else. But he was also very successful and skilled diplomat, so he negotiated with the Japanese leaders and convinced them it's better for them to send back those Korean captives. So he brought back several thousands of Korean prisoners of war from Japan to their home in Korea. So after that, of course, the Joseon court re-evaluated the Buddhist institutions. So it was partly for religious reasons and also for patriotic reasons that a lot of monks were involved in this war. And they were mostly mobilized to build the fortresses here and there. But some of them actually were engaged in combats. So that's why this story actually uses Master Samyang and also the war hero Admiral Yi both. But then, as you read in the story, that there's a Buddhist nun who was actually the leader for both. So you can see that it's quite an interesting story in terms of the sort of reversal of the positions. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Buddhist nun's position in Joseon society. But before that, maybe I can show the rest of the. Oops, maybe we can stop there. I have some more pictures. Let me see. Oh, maybe we can get them later. Buddhist nuns were the most marginal figures in Joseon. Why? Number one, they were women, therefore they were expected to behave as subordinate beings to men from Confucian point of view. Number two, they were Buddhists. So in terms of gender and in terms of the religious orientations, Buddhist nuns were completely ignored by or sort of underestimated, by the ruling elites of Joseon. And for the first few kings, they were useful because their consorts and some of them, they themselves were Buddhists. It was right after a long history of Korea. So personally, they had no objection to Buddhist rituals. But more and more, Joseon kings themselves became enthusiastic Confucians themselves. So by 16th century, now historians claim that Buddhist nuns had completely disappeared from Joseon society. We maybe see them, here and there, especially through folk tales. But as an institution, the Buddhist nuns community had disappeared. And one of the main reasons that a lot of historians believe that Joseon nuns disappeared by this time is that we have a very tyrannous king called Prince Yeon-san, and he actually disbanded all the nuns community just as his previous ancestors did with the monks communities. So what happened was that in the early years of Joseon, monks were all expelled to, so basically they were forced to move out of the capital city, and nuns were small in number, and much smaller than the size of the monks' community. So they were allowed to actually travel more freely than monks, and they could come to the palace. Why? We had royal consorts who had lost their, husband who happened to be king, and they needed some, religious consolation. So they were allowed to meet with them, and then they actually helped them to deal with all this life as a retired consorts. So within Joseon Palace, they had a small hermitage dedicated to nuns and the consorts who follow them. And obviously Confucian elites thought that this was just to handle these women's issues, not really a political thing. My research more and more showed the totally different picture of their role in Joseon society. And in fact, by the sixth king, King Seongjong, all the nuns' convents were completely closed, and the nuns had to also move out of the city walls. But they actually were lingering around the Seoul, the capital city, and they rebuilt their temples with all these timbers, whatever they could get from the previous temples. And they continued to practice, and they were very much involved in the lives of ordinary Koreans. And my research shows a lot of this indirect pieces of evidence that they also conducted rituals for poor and powerless Koreans during this period. So when Prince Yeonsan came, he really disliked all these nuns working near Seoul area, not within Seoul. So he banned them completely, and then he actually disrobed most of them, and those who refused to disrobing were made into kiseng. So either you choose a kiseng or you have to go back to your home. And many nuns actually had to voluntarily disrobe themselves, but some of them resisted. That's why the modern Korean historians believe that Buddhist nuns community had disappeared. And I literally accidentally came across a series of paintings that depict Buddhist nuns who actually are part of the ritual. So I'm going to show you those pictures in a minute. But anyways, so Buddhist nuns are total outcasts in Joseon society. And this story shows that the nun as a military hero, which is unthinkable. And Koreans themselves, when I mentioned that, I have found this story in southwestern part of the Korean peninsula, which is the area where a lot of naval battles were fought. So obviously, Koreans themselves, ourselves, do not know the existence of this story. There are only two stories related to the Hideyoshi invasion that I found so far. And two stories about Buddhist nuns and this war. One is very sad. One story, I try to make it short. It's about the area called Itaewon in Seoul. And I don't know if you heard about it, but Itaewon is a famous shopping area for international visitors and foreign tourists. And this is traditionally the area where U.S. military, U.S. troops were stationed until very recent time, until a few years ago. And the name of this village during Joseon is Itaewon, and in Chinese characters it's read as the village Itaewon pear tree orchid. Okay, so Itaewon means a beautiful pear tree orchid. So we thought it's very beautiful. But there's another name which is also pronounced as Itaewon, but has a totally different meaning, which is the village of a foreign umbilical cords. So where does this name come from? Now this is again unrecorded, unofficial history. So I did a little bit of investigation, and I found out that the name comes from a very sad consequence of this war. When Kato Kiyomasa, one of the Japanese commanders, retreated from Pyongyang, from North Korea, and his army was stationed in modern-day Itaewon area for a while, for several months. And it is said that there was a huge temple, Buddhist temple run by nuns. Now, if I think about the city border, it was right outside the capital city. So some version says about 400 nuns were living there and practicing. Some says 40. You never know. But anyway, it was called Unjongsa Temple, and the nuns were raped by Japanese soldiers. Many of them got pregnant. So when Korean King Seonjo, returned from his retreat in North Korea, in the first few months, he had to go away from Seoul. And this news of Japanese fast, advancement to Seoul. So when he came back, he saw the miserable state, and he didn't know what to do. Now we are talking about Buddhist nuns, whose first precept is not to take anybody's life. So they were all pregnant, and the court decided that they were allowed to build a small hut and live there in that area. And of course, they were not allowed to travel outside, and that's where they live with their newborn babies. So that's why the name came to be known also as foreign umbilical cords, foreign kids, basically. But then in the later period, the name sounded so tragic that the queen, one version says the queen ordered that the name go back to the original. So it's a beautiful, there are lots of beautiful, pear trees there. So it goes back to the original version of that name. So this is one story associated with this war. Again, women's involvement, and especially Buddhist nuns. But then we have a totally opposite kind of story, which is Master Chaun. So why is it Chaun? Purple always means something noble, right, in color symbolism. So this story shows that some mysterious ladies showed up on the shore and then deliberately created this suspicion among the Joseon Navy soldiers, and that was the way they make their presence known. The next day, they met Admiral Yi, and they taught him how to fight, how to build the ships, and also maritime geography and all that. So they are military councils. And among the three, the oldest was called Master Purple Cloud. Another version of this story, there are several versions that I've been collecting, and I'm still collecting because obviously, this folktale was so interesting. It traveled the different islands and the Southern Sea that each version had a new color. One version says that these nuns were wearing traditional Korean Zen sect's robe, the outer garment, which was sort of a red wine color. And three nuns in one version of this story portrays three nuns as powerful, mighty military heroes standing above a hill, and they use their these outer garments, which was a purple color, and they kind of confused the Japanese Navy soldiers that they were all in chaos. Finally, that helped the Admiral Yi achieve victory in that particular battle. So you can see why this particular character came to be known as Master Purple Cloud, either because of the color of the outer garment all the monks and nuns had to wear during Joseon, especially during formal rituals, or Purple Cloud itself already has auspicious sort of imagery. Okay, in Korean symbolism, color symbolism. That's why this master came to be known as Purple Cloud. So the story shows that the vulnerable, the first story shows how vulnerable Buddhist nuns were in Joseon society, and especially during this kind of foreign invasion. But the second story is completely different. We are talking about a social outcast depicted as a military hero, and especially as a military counselor for Admiral Yi Sun-sin, who was one of the, the most important heroes in Korean military history. So why this kind of story was created among in the popular imagination? And you can clearly see that those ordinary Koreans, many common people who were sort of very much disillusioned by the political structure and the helplessness or selfishness of the ruling elites, and in a way inefficacy of the Confucian ideology. And in fact, they chose the least likely person as a hero, as almost a messiah of the nation. So not the Admiral Yi Sun-sin was not enough. They actually brought in the kind of figure that nobody thought of it as a military hero, and then created a story. And by making up this kind of story, they expressed their discontent, their great disappointment, disillusion about the social structure that had to deal with for 2 centuries. So the ruling class was relatively okay, but so many Korean, especially peasants and fishermen in the certain area, suffered the kind of plunder and pillage of the Japanese pirates first, and then now the regular armies, that among so many different kinds of people they could deal with, they chose Buddhist nun as a hero of this story. So the way that I look at is, I don't know how realistic this is. However, when obviously an anthropologist went out and collecting all these folk tales, the person who obviously had heard of this story and reported this, it was written down in 1960s. So I believe there were several sort of new pieces of information added there, but they had to make it a bit real. So they brought in Master Samyong, who obviously is an important figure related to the Imjin War, and then 3 other women related to him, his fiancées, and other Buddhist nuns. So you see how they actually created this wonderful scenario of they foresaw the invasion of Japanese, and then afterwards they actually fought there. And then another version says that all these 3 nuns retreated to an island called Lotus Island. Actually, the name appears in the story itself, Lotus Peak. That's where they practiced until they died, and the government recognized their contribution. So very rarely Buddhist nuns were called masters, but they were given the title Great Master Purple Cloud by the government. So this is another version. Let me show you some of the paintings of Korean nuns during this period. This is what I discovered last year accidentally. I'm sorry, this is just title of one of the conferences that where I presented these paintings. This is the only painting of Buddhist nuns from pre-modern Korea, and you see it's from 1550. Okay, this is a formal painting of Buddhist nun who just joined monastic life. So she is kneeling down there, and she is showing her respect for her teacher, who happened to be also senior Buddhist nuns. This is the only painting in a sort of academic painting tradition. Now, this is very precious piece of information for people like me, because in Japanese Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism, there are lots of paintings, formal and folk, that depict Buddhist nuns. But in Korea, this is the only one. Then where did I find all these paintings? This is a very special genre of Buddhist painting, exists only in Korea, not in China or Japan, called sweet ritual, sweet nectar ritual. This is kind of a ritual that Korean Buddhists perform to allay the souls of the deceased. And in these paintings, it's a folk painting, it's very realistic. You find pieces of evidence that nuns were involved in these rituals. Okay? You see the monks sitting there, but a small group of nuns also sitting right side by side, right? Okay, you can see that monks are marked with this beard and kind of a thick eyebrows, and then nuns are wearing headgears. Now this is one of the famous paintings, and you can see nuns right to the left of this altar. It's kind of hard to tell. Again, monks and nuns together from 1730, and then again monks and then nuns. Here, nuns also have shaved heads, and then they don't have these headgears to. So you cannot tell clearly, but there is this kind of name tag on the painting says these are nuns. Again. Now you see some of these figures. Sorry. Right here, and they have a little bit of hair left to show that they are probationary nuns. They are not fully ordained nuns. This is, I cannot tell you how precious this painting is, because in the history of Buddhist nuns community, not just Korea, but in all Buddhist communities, this is the only painting perhaps we have clearly marked as probationary nuns. I haven't come across any paintings yet in any other place, in Tibet, China, any other places. So you see that even in this difficult anti-Buddhist social climate, Korean nuns are persistent in maintaining the ritual stages. First, you have to be a novice nun, and then secondary step is probationary nun, and then if you prove yourself cleared as a good material for monastic member, then you get fully ordained. So this painting shows probationary nuns as well as fully ordained nuns. In that sense, it's extremely important painting, not just for us, for Koreanists, but Buddhist scholars as well. Okay, again, this is early 1590s, right before the Imjin War. You can see nun actually playing a kind of instrument, a musical instrument, a religious music, as part of the ritual. It's the same thing. Here, a bunch of nuns actually, part of the ritual monks. And until now, until I presented these paintings, the dominant theory in Korea was that women were never allowed in Buddhist rituals, especially nuns were completely excluded. And I was a little bit afraid because I didn't get a formal training in paintings. So I was very afraid of presenting this claim, but then paintings themselves, just support me. So I couldn't help it. So I said, look, there are nuns in the ritual scenes. So probably we'll have to change, that perception that nuns were excluded from rituals in pre-modern Korea. Nowadays, they can conduct rituals on their own. They don't need a monk's presence in ritual. This is the difference between Catholic nuns and Buddhist nuns. So you see nuns already in the back. Some are close to the big drum, and lots of them. Okay, here nuns even reading sutras, right? Although it was almost, this painting was made in 1893, so pretty close to the end of the dynasty, you see that nuns were treated with more respect in this painting. Right now they are associated with the learning, sutra, knowledge, and all that. This is just same thing. But anyway, so this story basically shows that Joseon, the perception of Buddhist nuns in Joseon went through a big change after the Imjin War, and they were outcasts, but then they were brought to the center of this kind of a literary imagination. And indeed, we probably have to rewrite the history of Korean Buddhist nuns, even for Joseon period when anti-Buddhist policy was strongly implemented and maintained, that these female religious leaders were deeply engaged in day-to-day lives of Koreans, and we have to look at outside the official history, finding their existence in history. So I hope you learn both about, Imjin War and also Korean Buddhism. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Yeah. Mm. Yes, actually, Japan sent their envoys several times to Goryeo court and the Joseon court to get an entire copy of the Buddhist canon, the sutra, because Korea had to produce wood blocks to print these sutras in massive, quantity. Then the only way they could get the entire Buddhist sutra, the set of, Buddhist sutras, come to Korea and get a copy of that. So they actually pleaded with the Korean kings. It's such an irony that actually Joseon kings were confused and just gave away very easily. Then we have the only copy left from Goryeo period, only in Japan now. The rest were all disappeared, destroyed. Yes. I cannot hear you.
Could you tell us when releasing titles of lectures in Imjin,
Well, actually, it's such an interesting thing. These were part of the official collection of Buddhist paintings in Korea. Nobody paid attention to nuns in these paintings. It is not that, I went to all these different collectors or, mysteriously came across these paintings. These are already printed in Korea. But people have this preconception that Buddhist nuns don't appear in this painting. They all thought that the images of monastic members are male. But when I studied, obviously they were not, monks. Not all of them were monks. So I did more investigation. Indeed, some of the art historians thought that, well, they might be women. Then I presented all other materials like folk tales, other pieces of information from the official history book that how nuns were tortured because they helped this particular concubine to hide her boy to avoid all these court intrigues and assassination plans and all that. So now we know that there's a mounting evidence that they were there. So it's not that I met these collectors, but some of them, yes, private collections.
the offspring of the nuns in the Great, how were they received?
We don't know. It's just one of those legends. But it's so interesting. But, we have no other. I'm myself diligently looking for any lead to their existence, anything related to the story itself, because that means that there was a big temple. That's what counts. More to me, that it is that it shows that nuns were practicing and lived in large groups, in Seoul area. So if I find more, then I present it next time. We have another session like this. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. May I ask you one question? I'm trying to say about everything. I teach an African American history class, so I was aware of the African pearl divers. Where can I get a copy of that page? Is it on Google?